Welcome to the AI for Career Success video overview by Curt Robbins, where we help you get smarter than your competition. Today, we're going to dive into a really critical question. As AI becomes more and more a part of our daily lives, are we perhaps rushing to diagnose our interactions with it? So, our discussion today is really based on an article called Are We Pathologizing AI Use Too Quickly? It was published on LinkedIn back on January 29th, 2026. The author is Nick Potkalitsky, who's a PhD and a very well-respected AI literacy consultant and researcher over at Pragmatic AI Solutions. And, well, he raises some really important concerns about the kind of language we're starting to throw around. And you've probably seen these terms popping up, right? These kind of alarming new labels to describe how we're relating to artificial intelligence. We're hearing things like AI addiction, or even these very clinical sounding phrases like AI psychosis. It makes you wonder, what do these labels actually mean? This whole trend really brings up a critical question. Are we just jumping the gun here? Are we applying these clinical labels to how we use AI way too quickly? And maybe even more importantly, what are the consequences? What happens when we start using these really serious terms before the science is actually settled on the matter? Okay, so Section 1, Lessons from History. To really get a handle on the present situation, we've got to look to the past. Because as the author points out, this is not the first time we've been on this road. If you look at the history of how we've pathologized technology, there's a really clear pattern. It started back in the 90s with this super broad, kind of controversial term, internet addiction. Then in the 2000s, the debate shifted to smartphone addiction, which again got criticized for not being specific enough. The big shift, the real breakthrough, happened when the clinical world moved away from blaming the technology itself and instead started focusing on a very specific behavior. And that's what eventually led to a formal diagnosis: gaming disorder. And that crucial turning point really came down to this concept called functional impairment. See, the question stopped being, hey, how much time are you spending on the internet? And it became, is this behavior actually causing real, demonstrable harm? Is it messing with your ability to function at work or at school or in your relationships? That distinction is, well, it's everything. So what this whole history taught the clinical community was a really invaluable lesson. For any diagnosis to be genuinely useful, it has to be specific. It has to be tied to clear evidence of actual harm. That's the functional impairment part. These broad, sweeping labels that are often driven by a kind of moral panic, they don't help. In fact, they usually just muddy the waters. All right, Section 2. Why AI feels different. So you might be thinking, if we have these lessons from history, why does the conversation around AI feel so much more intense? Well, because AI is different. We're not just talking about another screen here. Unlike just passively watching TV or browsing a static web page, conversational AI has these very unique qualities. It's interactive, it's responsive, it can even feel relational. But the really crucial part is that it can be incredibly affirming. It can simulate understanding and basically reinforce a user's own view of reality, which is a whole different ballgame. And researchers are drawing a really critical line in the sand here. Look, people have always woven technology into pre-existing delusional systems. Think of someone getting messages from the TV. But the concern with AI is fundamentally different. Because it's so interactive and affirming, it has this unique power to not just be part of the delusion, but to actively amplify a person's existing psychological distress. So that brings us to Section 3, the risk of misdiagnosis. This whole idea that AI is an amplifier, not necessarily a cause, is so important, especially when you start to see how these concepts can trickle down and actually shape public policy. This is where Dr. Potkalitsky sounds a real alarm. He warns that a serious problem crops up when this sensational and frankly premature clinical language escapes the world of academia and gets into our everyday public conversations. Because once you frame a behavior as a pathology in the public's mind, it very often becomes the justification for these really blunt, reactive policies. And we see a pretty predictable pattern. It leads to restrictions, surveillance, and, you guessed it, outright prohibition. This is especially true within our educational systems. And the result? It's pretty predictable. Instead of approaching AI as a new kind of literacy challenge that we need to teach, institutions start treating it like it's contraband. Something that has to be hunted down and stamped out, rather than something we need to understand and learn to manage. Which leads us to Section 4, a more responsible framework. So what's the path forward here? The author suggests that we don't have to get stuck in this binary choice between complete denial on one hand and total panic on the other. There is a much more responsible way to think about this. This framework breaks down AI use into three distinct tiers. Okay, so at the top, you have clinical risk. These are the rare, serious cases that absolutely require intervention from the mental health system. The second tier is problematic use. These are patterns of behavior that are causing distress, but they require targeted support, not punishment or discipline. And then there's the third tier, normal high use. This is just intensive use, but without any loss of function. And the answer here isn't prohibition, it's literacy. So for an institution like a school, what this framework really champions is a harm reduction model. The focus shifts to things like universal AI literacy for everyone, putting in targeted safeguards for knowing risks, and creating really clear referral paths for mental health support when it's needed. And it does all of this without just resorting to a one-size-fits-all blanket ban. So the crucial point here, the real takeaway, is this. Rushing to slap a clinical disorder label on AI use doesn't actually lead to better care for anyone. In fact, what history tells us is that it leads to these blunt, often ineffective policies that just end up stigmatizing users and, frankly, getting in the way of developing some really essential new skills. Ultimately, the challenge here isn't whether AI can be dangerous. Of course it can. It clearly has risks. The real challenge is whether we can be clinically serious about those risks while at the same time being educationally wise in how we respond. Can we actually manage to avoid repeating the mistakes and moral panics we've seen before? Can we forge a more thoughtful, more nuanced path forward? Thank you for watching. This is where we teach you AI and help you get smarter than your competition. If you like these videos, use the QR code at the beginning or end of this video to buy us a coffee. We really encourage you to subscribe to the AI for Career Success YouTube channel. And of course, please like, comment, and share to help us reach a wider audience.